Welcome to NTD News. I'm Stephanie Cox. Here are today's top stories. Following testimony from the US ambassador to the European Union today, the White House says it's clear there was no quid pro quo. But within the ambassador's testimony, there were also things the White House didn't agree with. GM is suing rival automaker Fiat Chrysler over alleged racketeering in collective bargaining deals with the Auto Workers Union. GM says the deals put Fiat Chrysler at an advantage and hurt GM's business. A deadly fungus is spreading across the US. It affected over 400 people in 2018. An expert says it resists antibiotics and that the overuse of antibiotics has helped it spread. A California utility company has announced another power shutoff after admitting its power lines may have caused destructive wildfires. The company and the public are now seeking better ways to secure utility equipment. The White House says statements made by US Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland during public testimony today show there was no quid pro quo.
White House Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham released a statement Wednesday afternoon amid the hearing. She wrote that, quote, "No quid pro quo ever occurred. The U.S. aid to Ukraine flowed, no investigation was launched, and President Trump has met and spoken with President Zelensky." She drew attention to remarks like this one.
President Trump, when I asked him the open-ended question, as I testified previously, what do you want from Ukraine? His answer was, I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky to do the right thing.
Trump also echoed the statement, reading the transcript of Sondland's testimony from a notepad to reporters. However, Sondland alleged there was quid pro quo, though not tied to military aid to Ukraine. He said it had to do with a White House visit with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He thought Trump wanted a statement on investigations into former Vice President Joe Biden and his son Hunter. But he added that was his personal guess, not a directive from the president. Meanwhile, Vice President Mike Pence's office issued a statement disputing another of Sondland's claims made during the hearing. In Sondland's opening statement, he said he brought up concerns about withholding military aid during a September 1st meeting with Pence in Warsaw. Pence's chief of staff, Mark Short, said in a statement that the vice president never spoke with Sondland about investigating the Bidens, Burisma, or the conditional release of financial aid to Ukraine.
General Motors today filed a lawsuit against automaker rival Fiat Chrysler. The lawsuit alleges racketeering with the Auto Workers Union.
General Motors is accusing Fiat Chrysler and former Fiat Chrysler officials of engaging in bribery in the collective bargaining process with the United Auto Workers Union, leading to wage and work practice advantages. They say Fiat Chrysler corrupted the collective bargaining process with the union from 2009 through 2015, paying millions of dollars in bribes. 3 former Fiat Chrysler officials, who already pled guilty in a federal corruption probe of the union, were also named in this new lawsuit. GM's chief counsel Craig Glidden is arguing that the bribes allowed Fiat Chrysler to reduce labor costs in ways denied to GM, which damaged GM's business. Glidden also says GM is suing Fiat Chrysler and not the union because he believes Fiat Chrysler holds responsibility. At 4 p.m. Wednesday, GM and Fiat Chrysler shares both touched session lows, falling more than 3% and approximately 4% respectively.
U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper met his Vietnamese counterpart in Vietnam today. During his trip, he announced the U.S. would provide Vietnam with a ship for its Coast Guard to help it fend off encroachment by China.
At the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, Esper announced that the U.S. will provide Vietnam with a high-endurance cutter next year. He said the U.S. is committed to expanding the country's strategic partnership.
This includes providing Vietnam the capabilities it needs to protect its sovereignty and natural resources so it can continue to thrive.
Esper took aim at China, which he accused of bullying neighbors like Vietnam.
The United States firmly opposes intimidation by any claimant to assert its territorial or maritime claims, and we call for an end to the bullying and unlawful activities that are negatively impacting ASEAN coastal states.
China claims 90% of the potentially energy-rich South China Sea, but Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam also lay claim to parts of it. Besides being rich in energy, about $3 trillion in trade passes through the South China Sea each year. Vietnam has emerged as the most vocal opponent of China's territorial claims in the South China Sea.
And moving on to a deadly fungus spreading across the US. The CDC has labelled this antibiotic yeast an urgent threat. NTD's Miguel Moreno has the story from a doctor who says we've reached the post-antibiotic era.
Superbugs aren't anything new, but these drug-resistant germs are getting stronger. The CDC declared 4 germs an urgent threat this year. So we sat down with Dr. Amesh Adalja from Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, who broke down one of these germs for us.
With fungi, we're really interested in one specifically. It's something called Candida auris, which is a highly drug-resistant fungus that often preys on people in hospitals and has a very high mortality rate.
He said fungal cells are similar to human cells, which makes this superbug harder to treat than bacteria.
It makes it much more challenging that you have something that just targets the fungus without targeting the human.
Plus, over time, these superbugs develop stronger defenses against antibiotics. Fever and chills are some of the most common symptoms of Candida auris infections, and health centers in New York City carry much of the nation's burden. In 2016, a total of 37 cases were detected, 228 in 2017, and in 2018, just over 400 total cases were detected. But what has led to this superbug era? Unnecessary prescriptions are one reason.
We have to get rid of this antibiotic culture with people demanding antibiotics for every cough and sniffle that doesn't really require antibiotics. And
the CDC reports that 1 in 3 antibiotics prescribed are unnecessary. The doctor said physicians are enticed by good patient reviews.
Take the patient complaint. I've done it myself, taken the patient complaint and not prescribed somebody an antibiotic when it wasn't warranted. It's worth it to have administration yell at you for not prescribing an unnecessary antibiotic. Should be a badge of honor for physicians. And
the CDC's report also says that livestock can be given antibiotics that they don't need. Over time, this can produce drug-resistant germs that can spread to people through food and contact. Miguel Moreno, NTD News, New York.
A California utility company has announced another power shutoff in Northern California under pressure to prevent wildfires.
Due to windy and dry conditions, PG&E announced another round of power shutoffs today for counties in North Bay, North Valley, and Central Sierra to prevent more fire hazards. After some investigation, the utility company admitted their electrical equipment may have started the wildfires in Northern California over the last few years. A transmission tower may also have caused a Sonoma County fire that burned nearly 80,000 acres and forced 150,000 people to evacuate last month.
Some surface hits the line. The lines are not insulated, so they're basically exposed. Sometimes you can get a flash off that or sparks, and if the line is knocked down, then it comes into the ground, then immediately you get a whole array of sparks. It'll start a fire.
According to a PG&E spokesperson, the company's coverage area has about 100 million trees growing and can fall on power lines, so they inspect the lines every year.
Each year we also remove about 1.4 million dead or dying trees that have the potential to be hazardous. These are all part of our efforts to keep our customers safe.
They are coming up with ways to update and replace their equipment.
PG&E is looking at the overhead lines and actually adding a coating to make them more resilient. And then with our wooden poles, we're looking at ways we can replace them with composite poles or poles made of steel.
Many residents who live in areas affected by the recent power outages say they'd like their power lines buried underground as soon as possible.
Well, it seems to me like the electricity should pass underground, not overhead. And it is a big task, but it has to be done.
Some critics say the utility company should have started that process years ago. According to PG&E, it is complicated and expensive, but they are keeping that in mind.
It's important for customers to understand that undergrounding is a complex process and it can take years to underground lines. So it's not a short-term solution to wildfires, but it is something that PG&E is looking at long-term.
Reporting by Eileen N., NTD News, California.
Up next, a man who worked for the UK in its Hong Kong consulate says he was tortured by Chinese authorities. The UK Foreign Secretary has summoned the Chinese ambassador to answer the man's claims. More on what the man says took place when we return. A story has emerged today about a former UK consulate worker in Hong Kong who says he was detained and tortured in China. UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab has summoned the Chinese ambassador to the UK to explain.
Simon Cheng is a former employee of the UK's consulate in Hong Kong. He worked for the UK government for almost 2 years until earlier this month. He has spoken out about his 15-day ordeal that took place in August. He claims he was, quote, shackled, blindfolded, and hooded. Cheng was arrested on a trip to mainland China. He says Chinese secret police beat and chained him, deprived him of sleep, and kept him in solitary confinement. He says they pressed him for information on activists leading Hong Kong's anti-government protests. The UK government has made it clear that they believe the claims made by Simon Cheng are credible. UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab on Wednesday said Cheng's treatment amounts to torture and is a clear violation of international law.
Under the UN Convention Against Torture, there is an obligation on China, which is a state party to that convention, to investigate and hold to account anyone responsible for those kind of actions.
Later, a Chinese foreign ministry spokesman said that, quote, China would firmly oppose relevant remarks from the British side.
The Senate passed 2 pieces of legislation yesterday aimed at supporting protesters in Hong Kong. The bills are a warning to China against using violence to suppress demonstrations there.
The Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act was passed by unanimous consent. The act requires the State Department to give a yearly report on whether Hong Kong is sufficiently autonomous from Beijing to justify special trade privileges. The bill had broad bipartisan support in the Senate, with over half of the senators co-sponsoring it.
Peaceful protesters who are asking nothing more than exercise the rights that they were told were to be protected.
To the brave and resilient people of Hong Kong, the United States is with you. Your fight will not be in vain, and it doesn't go unnoticed.
And let us together send a message to the people of Hong Kong that their cries for democracy and freedom have been heard through both chambers of the United States Congress, and that America stands with them in
the people of Hong Kong need our support. They deserve our support, and they are depending on our support.
The people of America stand with Hong Kong.
The Senate has just sent a resounding message to the Chinese Communist Party and President Xi that the United States stands with the democratic protesters in Hong Kong.
The Senate also unanimously passed a bill to ban the sale of crowd control equipment like tear gas, pepper spray, and rubber bullets to Hong Kong police. The House still has to pass the same version of the bill before it's sent to President Trump. Rubio told our reporter after the bill's passage that the U.S. hears the Hong Kong people's voice and is standing by their side.
It's important that the world know clearly, number one, the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and who they are at a time when they're trying to go around the world portraying themselves as a benevolent power. And the other is that the people who are out there fighting for democracy, not just in Hong Kong, but around the world, know that the American people will continue to raise our voices on their behalf.
Rubio also encouraged young protesters in Hong Kong not to give up their fight and continue to raise their voices, saying, quote, history will judge them kindly.
And the House this evening just passed the same version of the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, 417-1. The House passed a previous version of the Act, but there was an amendment made in the Senate and the same version had to be approved in both chambers. It now heads to the President's desk to be signed. And up next, he's a doctor by day and runs a test prep business on the side. He's a veteran of Shark Tank and his entrepreneurship has made him millions. This entrepreneur shares the secret to his work ethic with NTD. More on his approach after the break. Uber reportedly wants to start listening in during customers' rides. That's according to a report by the Washington Post. The ride-sharing giant is set to start testing the feature in December in Latin America. The idea is to provide better security for Uber customers. This move comes after several high-profile assault scandals and growing safety concerns. But implementing it in the US will be challenging, as states have different laws regarding voice recordings and privacy. And entrepreneurship. It requires full dedication, so can you be a part-time entrepreneur? Shan Patel, now a resident physician, a Shark Tank veteran and CEO of his multi-million-dollar business, says you can.
29-year-old Shan Patel works as a full-time dermatologist in Philadelphia, but he has a side hustle, a test prep business with over $10 million in revenue.
On Shark Tank, when I was on the show, all of the investors, they said that, Sean, you can't be both a doctor and an entrepreneur.
While he is now, his secret? The same work ethic and productivity that helped him get a perfect score on the SAT test, start a business that helped other kids to do the same, and secure a $250,000 investment from Mark Cuban. How does he manage to work over 70 hours a week as a physician and also run his business? The first piece of advice is simple: turn your internet off.
Writing an article, writing something for a new book, writing a pitch, putting together a presentation, that doesn't really require internet. That makes a huge difference because I'm not, randomly going to facebook.com or I put away my phone. I often physically separate from it.
The other advice, start with the morning power hour.
Your mind is typically the most fresh in the first hour of the day. And I often see people waste this first hour on meaningless tasks.
Like replying to emails.
Replying to email requires almost no brain power, doing the most difficult task that you have of the day.
Patel got his work ethic from one man.
There's one person that I've met in my life that works much harder than I do, and that's my own father.
Patel's parents migrated to the US in the 1980s. To support his family, Patel's father worked at the pharmacist during the day and at night ran a motel. That's where Patel grew up.
And my dad is really the definition of the American dream. As came to this country with $70 in his pockets, he came from a poor village in India and he had nothing.
Patel's father helps him to see the value of hard work and persistence.
People want their success, their gratification now. They don't want to wait, they don't want to work for it. They want to post a picture on Instagram and get likes right away.
Has all the hard work brought him happiness? Patel said it's actually not the destination that he's chasing.
After I do this, I'll be happy. After I do this, I'll be happy. You will never be happy. My belief is you have to enjoy the journey.
He has enjoyed all the quiet hours learning things and building his dream from scratch, which is to have his own clinic while expanding his test prep business.
If I had the mentality, I'll only be happy when I have a dermatology company, it may or may not happen, it'll take forever. I think the really important lesson for people on happiness and work ethic is you have to enjoy the work to get there.
Penny Zhou, NTD News, Philadelphia.
Will anybody even own cars in the future? Or will we rely on electric driverless flying vehicles to take us wherever? Those are just some of the questions that London's Victoria and Albert Museum delves into after the break. From luxury handmade motors to futuristic flying cars, a new exhibition charts the sometimes bumpy road of the car at London's V&E Museum.
The exhibition celebrates the 130 years of automobile innovation, showcasing 15 cars and 250 objects. It takes visitors on a road trip from the first ever production car to a glimpse of what they might look like in the future. On display for the first time in Britain was the two-seater Pop-Up Next flying car, designed to relieve congestion in cities. The cars are not to be owned, but used like in ride-sharing services. It's inspired by aircraft fighters of the 1950s, incorporating wings, a cockpit seat, and jet engine technology that can reach a top speed said to be 200 miles per hour. Then there is Carl Benz's 1888 patent motor wagon number 3, with a top speed of almost 10 miles per hour, and recognized to be the first production automobile ever made. Luxury, too, is a common draw of the automobile, and its past is represented by the 1922 Hispano-Suiza skiff torpedo. It sports a handmade wooden body that mimics the torpedo shape of boats, and was made specially by Henry Labradette's workshop. The exhibition opens to the public on Saturday and runs until April 19th.
Ducks on a small farm in France may carry on quacking. A French court ruled yesterday, rejecting a neighbour's complaint about the noise.
The ducks are owned by a retired farmer in the foothills of the Pyrenees. My ducks make noise, and this bothers the neighbor. Her neighbor, who recently moved from the city, complained that the noise was making their life a misery and eventually filed a legal complaint. If she lost the case, she'd have to slaughter her ducks. It was hell, but she didn't want to give up her ducks. The life in the countryside is not the same, but if you live in the countryside to get away from the noise, for me it's dead. Noise is life, so I say I will keep my ducks. According to broadcaster France 3, the town's court ruled that the noise from the flock of around 60 ducks and geese was within acceptable limits. The dispute is the latest in a series of court cases that have pitted the traditional way of life in rural France against modern values, which country dwellers say are creeping in from the city. According to local media reports, another case in September involved a rooster named Maurice. A neighbor had filed for immediate steps to reduce the noise and for 3,500 euros in damages. However, the court ruled in favor of Maurice being allowed to continue crowing at the crack of dawn.
And that's all for today's news. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Stephanie Cox.